Hi, welcome and welcome back. I hope you're doing well. Today, I thought I would talk to you about burying the narcissist. And while there are many ways that you can look at that, metaphorically or just practically speaking, I'm actually referring to laying the narcissist to rest after they've passed away. And in a previous video, I spoke about when the narcissist dies, and I talked about some of the emotional things that come up. And then after that, I did a part 2 where I spoke about when the narcissist dies and some of the logistical things that come up that you may not even think about, but that come flying in your face, especially if the narcissist passed away suddenly. And depending upon your relationship, how close you were to them, and your level of responsibility in that process or at that time. When the narcissist dies, obviously, that's going to bring up a lot as it is. And you may just be an attendee at the services, but you may find yourself, if you have a narcissistic family member, like a parent or something like that, you may find yourself in a situation where you are actually the one planning and executing a funeral and burial for a narcissist in your life. And what do you do? How do you even go about that? How do you even process that? Do you even want to deal with it? And there's so many things that come up, and I completely understand. And you may need to just pass it along to somebody else who's in a better place to deal with it. Or you may have to take it on because everybody's looking to you. You're the solid one in the family. You're the rock. And they may need to lean on you or rely on you to handle things because you're more stable in your life, more even keeled, or maybe you have more resources, you have more money. And from a practical standpoint, you can afford to pay for it. Whatever the circumstances, here are some things that you might want to consider. And I hope that this is helpful to you. Funerals and burials are not cheap, and the costs are rising every year. And I got some statistics from the NFDA, which is the National Funeral Directors Association. And this data is from 2019, but hopefully it gives you kind of an idea of what's going on in terms of costs. So in 2019, the national median costs for a funeral with a viewing and burial was approximately $7,600 to $9,100. And then the median cost for a funeral with viewing and cremation was approximately $5,200. And the historic rates and future projections for burial and cremation went ranging from 2010 to 2040. For burial, for example, the percentage of burials in 2010 was 53.3%. The projected percentage of burials in 2040 is 16%. And then for cremation, the historic rates of cremation in 2010 were 40.4%, and in 2040 it's projected at 78.4%. So that's interesting. At any rate, the narcissist has died and you are in a situation where, say, for example, you're having to deal with burial and funeral services. A lot of times what will end up happening is if the narcissist dies suddenly, for example, the responsibility for putting together services and making all of that happen will fall into the lap of the closest survivor to the narcissist. And so depending on who that is and how the narcissist left things upon their passing, that can be very interesting. In my situation, when my dad passed away, for example, he and my mother were separated, and he did not have any money. He was homeless at the time. He did not have a will or any kind of anything, not even a letter. And he really didn't have any money. and he had no insurance. So there really was not anything available. There were no resources available and no plans made for his funeral and burial. So, because of that, the rest of us had to put our heads together and come up with a plan. At the time of his passing, my dad was not actively practicing with a religious group or actively attending any kind of church or anything like that. So we had to just kind of come up with something. And also, my mom, who had separated from him, was the closest surviving relative. And she was retired and, trying to get on with her life and, didn't have a lot of money, a lot of resources. And he hadn't really expressed any wishes. Even when they were married, he hadn't expressed any wishes. So, she had to kind of take the lead on things, but she had to lean on some of the rest of us to pitch in and help to pull things together and make things happen. To be honest with you, my husband and I ended up pretty much footing the majority of the bill for the funeral services and the burial, including flying his body from California to the Midwest, where we had the services and ultimately buried him. And I can't tell you right now what our costs were, but we worked with the same funeral director who had handled my grandmother's arrangements, and she had her stuff already planned and paid for in advance. So we went with the same funeral home, and that gentleman who ran it, we gave him the responsibility of taking care of the body, receiving it, and preparing it and whatnot, because we did have an open casket viewing, and we did the services right there at the funeral home. And then afterwards, we made arrangements for my dad to be cremated, and then made arrangements for him to be buried, his ashes to be buried, rather. And during the service itself that took place in the funeral home, my husband actually officiated the funeral. We really didn't have anybody else. My dad wasn't actively involved in any kind of a religious organization, so my husband did it. And then some of us got up and shared. And I think I told you that I talked about eulogizing the narcissist in another video, and that's where I got up and shared about my dad. So this was what we came up with, and it just kind of, that's how it worked out. There were some relatives who did send some checks for, relatively modest amounts of money to help out and to help offset some of the costs, which was very nice of them. And they put those into cards for my mom and expressed their condolences to her. One thing that happened also was the ambulance that transported my dad from the gym to the hospital where he ended up dying, they actually waived their fee. And we were very grateful to hear that, because my mom was going to get stuck with that bill. And she wasn't really even dealing with my dad during the last handful of years of his life. And she had legally separated from him. They were not divorced though. But she was going to get slapped with an ambulance bill, and transport is not cheap for those of you who are familiar. We were very grateful that they were willing to forgive and just waive that whole thing and make it go away. And then we went ahead and took care of the funeral arrangements and made the best arrangements that we felt like were suitable, were respectful, but it wasn't really an over-the-top engagement. And afterwards, some people had brought food, and we did a repast. I believe we did it right there at the location. I want to say maybe they had a room there that we were able to go to. If not, there was some other location that we went to that was close by where we were able to gather and eat the food that everybody had brought, kind of potluck style, and then interact with each other that way, say hi, catch up with folks we hadn't talked to in a while. And the burial was scheduled for, I think, probably a couple weeks later. And my husband and I were not able to stay for that. And there were some other logistical things with that were going to take a long time, like getting a marker for his grave. And what we decided with that was, because of the expense of burying his body, we made the decision to bury him in a shallow grave over his mother, my grandmother. Now, remember, her stuff was already paid for, so she already had a grave with a marker and the whole 9 yards. So one of the cost-effective decisions that we ended up making was burying my dad with her and putting him, if she was 6 feet under, then he was like 4. And doing it that way. We buried his ashes in a shallow grave over her and then added the marker to it at a later date. And while that wasn't cheap, it was certainly cheaper than doing a whole casket and a whole big to-do type of burial, or getting a vault or something like that, because a lot of those things can be extra. And even if you want to kind of upgrade the urn and that sort of thing, even if it's ashes for cremation, those things can be added costs. So those are just some things to keep in mind and to be aware of if you are faced with the decision of burying a narcissist, or faced with the task of getting it done or even paying for it. It's not cheap, and there are a lot of different ways to approach it. And sometimes, depending on the nature of your relationship with the narcissist, you may need to get a little creative, both for financial reasons and also just from a practicality standpoint. You just may need to get a little bit creative. And unfortunately, everybody's not necessarily deserving of a huge royal style funeral and all of the fanfare that goes along with that. Sometimes you have to just kind of do the basics and get it done and go on with the business of healing and living your life. Have you ever buried a narcissist? Comment below and share your experience or any ideas about the way that you approached it or what you think you might do in the case of being faced with that task of burying a narcissist, especially if it's someone that you were close to where maybe the responsibility or some of the responsibility fell in your lap. Burying narcissists, just like anybody else in your life, is not cheap. And sometimes because the narcissist is afraid of dying, afraid of talking about or planning for their death, it can be very challenging to work with other survivors to come up with a plan and be able to do it in a way that is tasteful, maybe without being over the top, and that works for everybody involved from a budget standpoint and just from a practical standpoint. It can be a very stressful time just in general, but there can be some added stress with the narcissist's lack of planning and just lack of foresight in terms of really thinking about the fact that there's going to come a day when they might not be here anymore. And also, there may be just some residual feelings that make it hard for you to just go there and to be able to do that, to be able to put together a plan or want to spend the money, want to write a check to contribute or things like that. It can be a very tough time and it can have you feeling very conflicted. Ultimately, you have to make a decision that you are going to be able to live with even after the narcissist has passed on. You're not alone and you're not crazy. Know who you're dealing with, know who you are. Take care, have a great weekend, and I'll talk to you soon. Bye-bye.